The sun had barely risen, but inside the glass towers of Lockridge and Cole Publishing, something irreversible was about to happen. The ink on a billion-dollar merger was still wet. The lawyers were sharpening their pens. Over 800 jobs were scheduled to be cut by Friday. In the boardroom, a CEO with a reputation colder than the marble floors beneath him was ready to sign off on the deal, but then he paused. Not because of a legal issue, not because of a market shift, not even because of a competitor's bid. He paused. Because of a shy cleaner, she didn't speak a word. She didn't protest. She didn't even look him in the eye. All she did was rearrange for dusty books on a forgotten shelf. That simple act, by a woman most people didn't even notice, changed the course of a corporation, saved hundreds of livelihoods, and shattered a man's heart wide open. Her name was Nina Alvarez, and this is the story of how one shelf became a turning point for everyone who thought their voice didn't matter. And if you think your life is too small to spark something big, wait until you hear what happened next. Nina Alvarez had always preferred the silence of early mornings. That particular Monday, the sun had barely kissed the skyline as she exited the subway and walked the 10 blocks to her cleaning job at Lockridge and Cole Publishing, one of the oldest and most powerful media firms in the country. She had started working nights there 3 months earlier. After her mother's hospital bills left them drowning in debt, Nina rarely saw daylight, let alone the polished boardrooms on the upper floors. Her world was vacuum cords, window cleaner, and coffee stains. But today, everything was different. Mrs. Edna, the longtime head janitor, had suffered a stroke the night before, and Nina, quiet, polite, invisible Nina, had been assigned her morning shift. She'd never been on the 42nd floor before. Her ID didn't even scan that high, but someone buzzed her up, mistaking her for someone else. She stepped off the elevator, heart pounding, pushing the cleaning cart forward like armor. The air was colder, the walls richer. Framed bestsellers lined the hallway. Books Nina had once dreamed of editing, maybe even writing. But that dream died when her father passed. She hadn't written in years. When she entered the executive boardroom, it was like stepping into a palace. Backed leather chairs, a long glass table that reflected the skyline, and at the far end, just behind the CEO's chair, stood a tall oak bookshelf full, but carelessly so. Nina wheeled her cart to the corner and began dusting. Then her eyes landed on a shelf above her reach. There were 4 books, each awkwardly positioned, not by subject, not alphabetically, just jammed in randomly. But the titles. Oh, the titles whispered something familiar. The Roads We Abandon When Silence Screams Ashes and the Rain Begin. Again her breath caught. That was a story, a journey, her journey. And suddenly, like a painter called to canvas, she reached up and rearranged the books. She placed The Roads We Abandon first because that's where all heartbreak begins. Then, When Silence Screams because pain often hides in quiet places. Next was Ashes and the Rain for the grief no one sees. And finally Begin Again because hope doesn't ask for permission, it just returns. She stepped back, hands trembling, and whispered, "That's better." And then a voice behind her cut through the air like a dagger. "Who are you, and why are you touching my books?" She spun around. Standing in the doorway was Elier Vance, CEO of Lockridge and Cole. He was younger than she expected, mid-40s, maybe, but with silver streaks in his hair and the reputation of someone twice his age. Ruthless, calculated, brilliant, the kind of man who took no prisoners. She froze, couldn't speak. He stared at her, not with rage but confusion. "Did you touch these books?" Nina nodded. He walked forward slowly. His eyes traced the shelf, then back to her. "Why did you put them in that order?" She hesitated. Her voice, barely a whisper, "Because they tell a story." He blinked. "What story?" "A story of someone who gave up, stayed silent, broke, and still tried to begin again." There was a long silence. Elier's hand rested on Begin Again for a moment. Then he said nothing, just turned and walked out. Nina gathered her things, heart racing, sure she'd be fired. But what she didn't know was that Elier Vance hadn't just read those books before. They were his father's, and Nina had just unknowingly recreated the exact order in which his father once read them to him, when Elier was a scared teenager who had lost his mother and almost lost himself. The elevator doors closed behind Elier Vance. But his mind was still trapped in that boardroom, still staring at those 4 books, newly arranged by a woman whose name he didn't even know. For the first time in years, his morning schedule slipped from focus. His phone buzzed in his pocket with reminders, but he didn't look at it. He just stood there, letting the silence settle over him like fog. The titles. The sequence. It wasn't random. It was exactly how his father used to tell him stories when he was young and frightened, especially after his mother's passing. Elier could still remember the late nights in their tiny apartment in Bridgeview. His father, a school librarian, had little money but an endless love for books. He used stories like scaffolding, building Elier's strength page by page. Now those same books, those same titles, in that same order, had been arranged in a sterile boardroom by a stranger, not a consultant, not a partner, a cleaner. She didn't know, couldn't have known. And yet, she had reminded him of something he had forgotten. Not just his father, not just the past. She reminded him of the version of himself who once believed business could be a force for good, not just a machine that made money. He stepped off on the 40th floor. But instead of heading to his office, he took a detour into a quiet corner room, the last place in the company where he kept anything personal. It was rarely used, full of old files and untouched bookshelves. He opened the drawer of a small cabinet. Inside was a photograph, himself, around 14, standing next to his dad outside the city library, his father's arm draped over his shoulder, both smiling, real smiles, the kind Elliot hadn't worn in years. He stared at it for a long moment. The hum of the building's ventilation system, the only sound. Then he turned it over. In faded pen were 4 words. Stories build better worlds. His father's words? A phrase he hadn't thought about in a decade. Not since taking over the company, not since he'd started measuring success in quarterly earnings instead of human impact. By the time Elliot returned to the executive floor, his assistant was waiting with contracts in hand. The merger presentation was loaded. The board was arriving. But something inside him had shifted. He looked out over the skyline, his reflection faint in the boardroom glass. Somewhere below, hundreds of employees were working like their jobs weren't hanging in the balance. But they were. They didn't know the merger would mean sweeping layoffs. They didn't know that algorithms were being chosen over editors, that departments would be erased, that names would become numbers, and yet, one cleaner had seen more clearly than all of them. Downstairs, Nina had nearly finished her shift. She kept her head low as she moved from room to room. No one spoke to her. No one ever did. But inside her, something strange was unfolding. Not fear of being fired, but peace. For the first time in a long time, she'd left something behind that mattered. A tiny imprint, a silent message. She didn't know the CEO had noticed. She didn't know that the books, to him, were sacred. She just knew that she had to put them in the right order. As if it was her responsibility. As if someone out there needed to be reminded that broken things could still be rebuilt. That's when she heard the voice over the intercom, crackly and unexpected. Nina Alvarez. Please report to Human Resources on the 12th floor. Her stomach dropped. That was it. She was going to be let go. No one called you to HR after breaking protocol and touching a CEO's shelf unless there were consequences. She stepped into the elevator, gripping the handle of her cart like a lifeline. The ride felt like a slow fall. Every floor ticked by like a countdown. She replayed the moment in her head, how her fingers had traced those dusty book spines, how she'd whispered that's better to a boardroom that wasn't hers. The HR lobby was sterile, full of modern art and clean glass. The receptionist gave her a small smile and nodded toward an office. Inside, a man in a gray suit looked up from his desk and gestured for her to sit, but before he could say anything, the door opened again. Elliot Vance walked in, not flanked by lawyers, not scowling, just quietly observing. Nina stood instinctively. You're Nina, he said softly. She nodded. You rearranged the shelf in the boardroom this morning. Her throat was too tight to speak. She nodded again. Elliot turned to the HR officer and said calmly, We're done here. The man blinked. Sir, she's not in trouble. In fact, Elliot said, turning to Nina, she's coming with me. Nina's knees nearly buckled. What? What do you mean? I have a question, Elliot said, and I think you're the only person here who can answer it. She followed him down the hallway, past suited executives and double takes from assistants. When they reached his private office, he opened the door and motioned for her to enter. On the center table sat the 4 books, neatly arranged, just as she'd left them. He sat across from her. Tell me, he said, how did you know? She looked at the books, then at the city outside the window, and then, in a voice steadier than she expected, she replied, I didn't know. Not about you, not about your story, but I know pain, I know silence, and I know that books speak to us, if we listen. He leaned back in his chair, the quiet stretching between them like a bridge. No one in this building would have noticed what you noticed, he said, not even me. And then he did something he hadn't done in over a year. He smiled, not the kind of smile you offer to investors, a real one, soft, uncertain, but true. And that's when the thought first came to him, quiet at first, ridiculous. Even what if this merger wasn't the answer? What if he'd spent so long chasing numbers that he'd forgotten stories? And what if Nina Alvarez, the cleaner with dust on her sleeves and poetry in her soul, had just saved something far more important than a deal? She had seen the heart behind the chaos. And now, it was time to listen. The next morning. Nina returned to work, expecting everything to go back to normal. She even packed a fresh pair of gloves, just in case the CEO's invitation had been a one-time moment of kindness. Maybe he'd been moved for a second. Maybe the books reminded him of someone. People feel things and forget them just as quickly. She wasn't important. She knew that. She was just a cleaner. But when she arrived, a different security guard met her at the lobby. You're on the executive floor today, he said with a nod. CEO's instructions. She blinked. Is Mrs. Henderson back? No. But he didn't assign you to the boardroom. He wants you near his office. And you're not expected to clean. That made even less sense. What was she supposed to do, just stand around? Still confused, she made her way up the private elevator. When the doors opened, everything felt different. The air was sharper, brighter. The receptionist gave her a strange, almost respectful smile. Inside the CEO's office, Elliot was pacing, a mug in hand, the same 4 books now laid out on the table behind him. He looked up as she entered. "I hoped you'd come," he said. "I work here," she replied, unsure how else to respond. He smiled again, this time a little wider. "Right, of course. But today, you're not here to clean." Nina shifted uncomfortably. Then, "What am I doing?" He paused for a moment, then motioned to the couch across from his desk. "Helping me remember." That wasn't the answer she expected. He sat down, placed the mug on the table, and took a deep breath. "My father died 6 years ago," he began. "Heart failure. It wasn't sudden. It was slow, painful. But before he passed, he said something I haven't thought about until yesterday." Nina stayed silent, her hands folded tightly in her lap. He said, "Don't build a company. Build a compass." Ellier's voice lowered. I didn't know what he meant. Not really. I thought he was just being sentimental. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw exhaustion behind his eyes. Not just physical, soul deep, the weight of too many compromises. "But yesterday," he continued, "when I walked into the boardroom and saw those books, something clicked. Like a mirror was held up to everything I've become, and I didn't like what I saw." Nina opened her mouth, but no words came. She wasn't used to this kind of vulnerability, especially from people in $1,000 suits. He leaned forward. "I've built something big, Nina, but I'm starting to wonder if it's still good." Still, she said nothing, but inside her, something stirred, a strange, quiet certainty. He arose, walked to the window, and looked out. "I'm about to sign away everything we stand for. The merger will bring billions. Everyone says it's the smart move. But yesterday, you made me remember my father's voice, and now I can't stop hearing it." He turned to her. "What if this company could be more than just profitable? What if we could make it meaningful again?" She finally spoke, softly, "One story at a time." He smiled. "Exactly." That's when his assistant entered, carrying a printed folder. "The board is waiting." "Sir?" Elliot took the folder and looked down at the merger contract. "Let them wait." He turned to Nina. "Walk with me." She hesitated. "I shouldn't. You already did more than anyone in this building has in years," he said gently. "You reminded me of what matters. That means you belong here more than most." They walked down the hallway together, side by side. The sight drew curious glances from executives and assistants. No one dared speak, but everyone noticed. When they reached the boardroom, Elliot paused. "I need you to hear what they say, and tell me later if I've lost my way." Nina nodded. She didn't understand all of it, but she understood one thing. He needed someone who saw the soul of things. Inside, the room buzzed with tension. Executives straightened their ties. Laptops clicked open. Charts flickered to life on the screen. Elliot didn't sit. He stood at the head of the table and opened the folder. But instead of reading the contract, he placed it down, and then he spoke. "When I was 13, he said, my father gave me a book instead of a birthday gift. He said stories would teach me what money never could. Back then, I thought he was being cheap. Now I know he was trying to save me." He looked around the table. This company was built on words, on stories that moved people, stories that mattered. But somewhere along the line, we stopped listening. To the ones that really counted, there was silence. No one interrupted. He turned toward the bookshelf. "Yesterday, someone on our cleaning staff, someone no one here had ever spoken to or arranged for books on that shelf. No memo, no instruction. She just did it." He picked up the books and held them one by one. This wasn't decoration. This was a message. One that reminded me who I used to be. He placed the books back down. "I'm not signing this merger. Not today. Maybe not ever." Gasps, whispers. One board member leaned forward, angry. "You can't be serious. This deal is worth $2 billion. Ellier's voice was calm, but firm. "You're right. It is. But it'll cost us something far more valuable." "And what's that?" someone snapped. He turned his eyes toward Nina, standing quietly at the back of the room. "Our story." The room fell silent, and for the first time in a long time, Elliot felt something powerful rising inside him. Not fear, not profit, conviction, the kind that doesn't come from numbers, or charts, or advisors. The kind that comes from listening to the people the world forgets to hear. And behind him, Nina stood motionless. But inside her, a light had flickered on. She had been invisible her whole life. Until now. The boardroom stayed quiet long after Elliot left. Papers remained untouched. No one reached for their coffee. One executive whispered something about shareholders. Another stared blankly at the now closed contract, as if it might change on its own. But Nina didn't linger. She stepped out quietly, just as she had stepped in and noticed by some unforgettable 2-1. By the time she reached the elevator, her heart was racing. She wasn't supposed to be part of this. She was a cleaner. She wiped fingerprints, emptied trash, moved through spaces without leaving footprints. And yet, somehow, she had changed the course of an empire with nothing more than a feeling, and for carefully placed books. Elior caught up with her before the doors closed. He didn't speak right away. He just stepped in beside her, silence between them like an old friend. I meant what I said, he finally whispered. She looked down. I don't know what I did. He shook his head. That's the point. You saw something. You reminded me that stories don't need to be loud to matter. Sometimes they just need to be real. They rode in silence, the hum of the elevator, somehow grounding them both. That night, back in her small apartment 2 train stops away, Nina sat by the window with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She stared at a notebook she hadn't opened in years. Its first page was wrinkled, the ink faded from an old water stain. In the corner was her name, Nina V. Castillo. Stories I'll Tell Someday. She had written that title when she was 16. The day after her mother passed, that notebook was filled with pieces of her unfinished stories. Characters based on people she'd met cleaning office buildings. Poems about forgotten elevators and overheard conversations. Some were only a sentence long. Others trailed off mid-thought. She hadn't touched it in a long time, but something had changed. That night, she picked up a pen and began writing again. The next day at work, she found a sealed envelope taped to her locker. Her name was written in gold ink. Inside was a single typed sentence. Every company has a janitor. Very few have a storyteller. Beneath it, a note from Elier. There's a small office on the 7th floor. It's empty, until now. I'd like you to fill it with whatever stories you see that no one else can. Start today. She clutched the paper to her chest, unsure whether to laugh, cry, or run. For the first time in her life, someone didn't just see her work, they saw her worth. But the moment she stepped into that tiny 7th floor office, she realized something else. Not everyone would welcome her voice, because some stories expose what others work hard to hide. Within days, whispers began to circle. She's not qualified. Why her? She was a janitor a week ago. Nina heard it all, and some of it she almost believed until a woman named Grace knocked on her door. Grace was head of HR, mid-50s, sharp glasses, even sharper instincts. She sat across from Nina and asked, "Do you know why this company was started in the first place?" Nina shook her head. "Not for profits," Grace said. "Not for bestsellers. Elier's father used to say, if you can find the story no one else is telling, you'll never lose your way. I think that's why you're here. Not because you're loud, but because you notice the quiet." She handed Nina a file. "There's something I want you to read." The idea felt dangerous, but powerful. Together, they worked day and night. Ruben still had the original manuscript in cut. Raw, real. They updated it, wrote a new foreword, and titled it the version they didn't want you to read. When they brought it to Elier, he didn't hesitate. "Let's do it," he said, "and let the world know who Clara Castillo really was." The marketing team went quiet at first. This wasn't a feel-good comeback. It was a correction, a challenge, a bold act of truth-telling. But once word got out, the story caught fire. Media outlets picked it up. Forgotten editor silenced in 2000 gets posthumous redemption. The chapter that could have changed lives now finally published. Readers responded. Thousands of letters, messages, people who had faced similar censorship, teachers, writers, dreamers, they all said the same thing. "Thank you for telling the truth." The book soared to #1, not because it was marketed to be a hit, but because it mattered. The company's culture shifted. Employees began speaking up more. They formed a new committee, the Storykeepers Circle, to protect editorial integrity and honor those who quietly shaped the voices of a generation. And at the center of it all was Nina. She had walked in as a night cleaner and seen unheard. Now, she was something else entirely. Not a hero, not a boss, but a reminder that small acts can ripple, that quiet voices can move mountains, that sometimes the people we overlook carry the very truths we need to survive. One rainy afternoon, Nina stood at the building's lobby window, looking out over the city. Grace walked up beside her. "No," Grace said gently. "I think Clara would be proud." Nina smiled. "She always told me, stories don't end when we stop reading. They end when we stop believing they can still change something." She turned to Grace and I. "Believe we've only just begun." As the clouds parted and the sun broke through, Nina Castillo walked away from the window not as a cleaner, not even as an editor, but as the woman who had proven that sometimes the smallest hands carry the loudest truths. And the shelf she, once rearranged, it stood unchanged in the CEO's boardroom, exactly as she'd left it. A permanent reminder that quiet courage can rewrite even the coldest destinies. Asterisk.